Hey guys, this is Dave from Valor Fire Training, and in this week's episode of Q&A, we have Jonathan Brumley from Engine 3 in Denver, Colorado. He spent about 6 years down in Houston before moving out to Colorado and has been out there ever since with his family. He's also an instructor with Fire by Trade and kind of does all things engine. I know off camera we were just talking about our love for truck company stuff. I have a huge
Absolutely.
I have a huge passion for rescue. Like you give me a 40-foot walk-in heavy rescue and I'm in hog heaven.
Yeah,
Um,
man. I'm all about it. Give me a saw and a hook. Let's do it.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, everybody has their niche, but engine is kind of your thing. And
Yeah.
I had a question that came in from Blake in Iowa, and I'm going to read it. Let me pull it up. So Blake asked, let me scroll back up here. All right. So Blake asked, with all the information coming out from manufacturers and a lot of information coming out in classes around the country, what is your favorite flow for attack lines and why? And especially this question. I mean, when we go teach engine company stuff for Valor, it's very, I don't want to say dynamic, but I mean, we're not just stuck with like 7/8 or 15/16 or 160 at 50. I mean, we talk about automatics, we talk about selectable gallonage because there's so much information out there. And I get this question a lot, and I know you probably do too.
Yeah.
Uh, but every instructor has their own. I mean, we all have our own favorites, right?
Yeah,
And so I
we
think it's a
do.
great question because, you know, my favorite isn't going to be yours for different reasons. So, what do you think? What's your take on that?
Man, I think it's kind of it, it's very situational. We'll start with that. And so my preference isn't necessarily going to work in all atmospheres. So I'll start it with that disclaimer. I am a smoothbore guy. And there's many reasons why, but we'll just leave it at that for right now. I'm a smoothbore guy for sure. And on the past two engines that I've worked on consistently, both engine 26 down in Houston and now engine 3 here in Denver, 15/16 is what we're using. And I'm a big fan of it. I really am. Then I very much enjoy the flows that we're getting out of that. It fights so much fire. And 2 3 rooms in a residential, big room in a residential, whole living room on fire, and 15/16 will knock that thing down right away. So that's pretty phenomenal. And like I said, not everybody has the ability to staff lines with 3 guys on the line, usually nozzle firefighter, officer, and a backup firefighter in my world. And the 15/16 works phenomenally in that situation. Now, if you're on a lower staffed engine where, you've got your nozzle firefighter, maybe an officer back down the line of ways, that's not always the best attack package. It can be a lot to handle, especially if you're trying to keep the nozzle open while you're moving down hallways, things like that. And I think that's where 7/8 really comes into play, is kind of that understaffed engine. Or maybe for the engine crew that isn't quite dialed where they want to be yet. And I don't mean that to say that if you're using 7/8, you're not a dialed firefighter. Please don't get me
Right.
wrong in
I
that,
was I was gonna be like, hey,
because there's
bro.
so many guys who can use the 7/8 well. But if your target flow is that 185, but your crew isn't there yet, I feel like dialing things in with the 7/8 is the way to go, and then see progressively if you feel like the 15/16 is where you want to end up at. If you have, 3 guys on the line pretty consistently is where I would kind of put my disclaimer on that. There's a couple of reasons for that. Reason being the volume, and then also there's some margin of error there.
Mhm.
And if we're using a 7/8 tip, especially with the lower quality hose, 1 kink, 2 kinks in the line, and you're getting below that 150 mark pretty quickly, 150 gallon mark. And I, I feel like that's like the absolute minimum that you want to have in most circumstances.
Yeah, I
I know
agree.
that there are departments, entire departments, big departments, that are flowing significantly less than that, doing okay. But just from what I've seen, there's no reason that we shouldn't be flowing at least 150 gallons per minute. It's very manageable in terms of nozzle reaction, very manageable in terms of moving around your 1 3/4 lines. There's no reason why we shouldn't be be setting the minimum at 150.
Yeah.
And I feel like with the 7/8, you're just kind of skirting that line the whole time. And for a lot of departments, they're having to over pump it because their lines aren't playing well with the 7/8. So unless you got a hose and nozzle package that's paired really well, um, you know, you can walk that line really easily. Where the 15/16 is giving you a little bit more margin for error, I feel like. So that's kind of where I'm at on 1 3/4. As far as 2.5 goes, again, I think that's kind of situational. And I think that we've found a real good sweet spot on my engine. When it's coming off of the tailboard in our bulk load, we use an 1 3/16. Majority of the time, we're going to be using that in bigger fire situations. We need that knockdown power. We need the reach for, commercial fires, entire residential buildings on fire. The 1 3/16 is phenomenal for that, but it's not necessarily something that I want to take upstairs in a high rise.
Right.
That's a big ask in a hallway, where you are going to have to move that through a hallway, potentially around stairwells and stuff like that. And so manpower is going to be tied up in your pinch points and not going to necessarily be helping you at the nozzle unless you've got some pretty incredible staffing. So that's where I really like the 1 1/8 tip. If I'm standpipe firefighting, I really like the 1 1/8. So that's kind of where I'm at on my attack lines.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up some great points, and I was kind of taking notes while you were talking because I hear stuff and I'm like, oh my God, we got to go back to that. So you and I differ a lot in our worlds because with you having the staffing that you have, and then looking at like my volunteer department, I don't know who I'm going to get on Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the
Mhm.
afternoon. Like I might get 8 people, I might get 3 people, I might get 2 people. Like it's just we don't have specific staffing models, and so we kind of have an idea, like everybody knows who's in town or who's available.
Mhm.
But we went with the 7/8, but it was a completely different animal because we built our hose and nozzle packages around that tip.
Right.
So
And
we
that's how it
float.
should be for
Yeah.
any nozzle.
Yeah. And truly, I mean, from my perspective, because this was years ago, I mean, this is like 4 or 5 years ago, that was the first time that I had the ability to, because of the position that I was in. I'm like, man, you guys are giving me a budget and I can buy whatever hose I want, and so we went through committee process and we looked at it. Um, but yeah, we paired our nozzle. It's like pairing a fine wine with some cheese. It's like you want to
Yeah,
make sure that
absolutely.
everything goes together. And so we did. And I love what you said about the 2.5, because I think so many people get sucked into, oh my God, everybody's got 1 3/16, and 1 3/16 is the greatest thing ever. We don't have high rises. We have more like 60 by 100 Morton buildings.
Mhm.
And so for us, the engine 3/16 is great because that's going to be our kind of bread and butter type commercial fire. But then if you go into the full-time department that I work for in Edwardsville, I mean, we're still flowing 1 3 or 1 3/4 for our high rise packs. We have 75 psi fog nozzles. So it's not like we're not. I mean, I wish I could be like, man, we're all smooth bore, but I mean, it just depends on what rig I'm on and where I'm at, whether I'm going to have
Mhm.
a fog nozzle or a selectable gallonage or automatic. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Jay Bonifield brings it up a lot. He's like, choose your hill to die on. And I said I'm a smoothbore guy, but the thing is like, that's not a hill that I die on at all.
right.
If you're a fog nozzle guy, awesome. Find a fog nozzle that has a good nozzle reaction, that is paired well with your line, just like you would a smoothbore nozzle. What I choose to die on is high pressure versus low pressure in your
Yep.
attack system. And so if you're using a high pressure fog nozzle, you got to do a lot of explaining, as to what benefit is this really giving you, because it's being proven over and over that these fixed gallonage fogs at 50 psi and 75 psi, even, I mean, not necessarily my preference, but 50 psi fogs are freaking rock star nozzles,
Yeah.
so that's the hill that I'm going to die on. Is let's have a conversation about high pressure versus low pressure long before we have a conversation about fog versus smoothbore.
Well, and I love that sentiment of, and again, I mean, I don't intentionally get into arguments with people, but I mean, when I go teach, like even when we were down at Lake of the Ozarks together, I would have that conversation with certain firefighters, and they're like, "Oh man, you're all about smooth bores." I'm like, "Dude, no. You give me
Mhm.
any nozzle with good hose, and I will go put that fire out." Like,
Absolutely.
you could give me the crappiest nozzle ever that doesn't even make a good pattern, and I will still go in and put fire out. But if I had to pick my choice, it would be a smooth bore. That's what I'd like
Right.
to do. So how and I'm going to ask you this. So how much do you think, from a manufacturer's standpoint, how much do you think has changed with attack nozzles in the last like 10 years? Because I feel like we've had a lot of stuff, and some of it has been good, some of it has been bad. But I feel like there's been more emphasis put on that question, what we just talked about, from the manufacturer's standpoint than there ever has been in my career before this.
Hmm. Um, I think you see two sides of it. I think you see the manufacturers saying, "Hey, we recognize the successes we had in the past, and we're going to go the direction of simplicity." And you also have other manufacturers who are like, "We're going to go in the completely opposite direction. We're going to throw every trick in the book at this particular nozzle because we kind of want to be the anti simplicity
Right.
at this point, because honestly, bells and whistles sell to some individuals.
Sure. Sure.
And so there has become a huge divide, I feel like, between particular manufacturers in that regard. One is trying to go back to metal bales, full round balls, just straight solid tubing, while others are like, man, we're gonna have pistol grips that fold, we're gonna have a fog on top of a smoothbore that folds down, we're gonna have deals inside that are spinning, as well as teeth that are spinning on the other side. Like, literally, you name it, it's been added to the other side. And for me, what I've found is simplicity has won out in my book.
Yeah.
The simpler the process, the less likelihood there is that debris is going to get inside of it. The more likely I am to get the flow that I'm expecting when I open up that nozzle, and the pump operator gives me the pressure that he's desiring as well. I mean, simplicity is where it's at in my book.
Yeah.
So I think we've seen a divide there, but the other part of it is I think that we've seen manufacturers recognize that people aren't stupid who are buying these nozzles, and that they're starting to learn what questions really need to be asked when it comes to these purchases, and recognizing how valuable it is to pair that with the hose packages that we have now as well. And I think we've seen more advances in trying to meet the needs of the consumer from the hose manufacturers than we have from the nozzle manufacturers, which is a good thing. And I just finished up an article on all of the different hose sizes that we have available to us now. There are so many intermediary hose sizes, from so many different manufacturers now, and that comes from manufacturers listening to firefighters who are saying, I want this specific target flow. This is the nozzles that I'm going to be pairing my hose with,
Yeah.
and I want the ideal package for that. And so I think we've got manufacturers on the hose side listening a little bit more than we do from the nozzle side.
Yeah. I think, and I totally agree with you. I think the nozzle stuff, we started seeing that change 4, 5, 6 years ago. And
Hmm.
it's now gotten to the point where, and I'm not, I know you're not knocking anyone. I'm not going to knock
No.
anyone specifically, but I'm always all about innovation. Like, you hand me a nozzle that's got a, air horn whistle, or, whatever you want to put on it. I don't care. Give me a flashlight. Like, that's the one thing I'm still super surprised that nobody has done like a built-in hydraulically powered flashlight on the front of a nozzle. So somebody watching, there's your $1 million idea. But yeah, I mean, I'm all about the whiz bang gizmos if they work. But I
Hmm.
just feel like sometimes there's so many things that go on there. And I love what Brian Brush had said this in a class at one point, but he goes, it's fixed gallonage or smoothbore nozzles. They're binary. It's on off. That's
Right.
it. Like, you don't
Right.
have to worry about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, God, that just, it was like a punch in the face. I'm like,
It
that
certainly
totally makes
is.
sense now.
Yeah.
So, but no, I agree with the host stuff. I really am curious to see because I feel now more than ever, like when we were talking about that fine wine and cheese, uh, I've had so many phone calls in the last probably 6 months from people, and they're like, "Oh, what do you think about this 1.77? Or what do you think about this 1.88? Or what do you think about this 2.25?" And I'm like, "Bro, I don't know. Like, what are you trying to? What are you doing? Like, what's
Yeah,
your flow? What's your nozzle? What's your? There's so many different configurations."
right. And I mean, I kind of got into an argument early on, especially bringing up the 2.5 versus 2.25 with a mentor of mine. And I'm like, well, it sounds like suburban versus urban firefighting. And he's like, whoa, hit the pause button there. You know, that's not what this is at all. Um, it is totally up to the infrastructure of the fire department to determine what is best in that regard. It's not an urban versus suburban conversation. It's what are my target hazards? What standpipe equipped buildings do I have? What type of stretches do I have? Because all of those types of things are what's going to dictate the line size.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily just, hey, this is the new whiz bang idea that I think is going to be awesome across the country. No, it's does my department's infrastructure, my department's response territory support the move to this new size hose line? And that's the perspective that we have to take. It's not just, hey, my neighbor decided that 2.25 is really cool.
Right.
And it's not just, oh, read this on, you know, whatever thread on the internet that it's lighter and easier to move. No, there's a lot more circumstances that come into play
Sure.
than just, you know, weight or stretches. Like you have to take all of this as a conglomerate and decide as a whole, will this meet the needs of my fire department across the board before you make a decision like that. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think it's great that people are having those conversations because coming up in the fire service, that wasn't even like nobody knew what kind of hose you had. It was,
No.
I mean, inch and a half, 2.5, 3 inch, 5 inch, 4 inch. Nobody knew like, oh, this is EDPM rubber and this one is, full jacket or the nozzle. This is
Mm-mm.
a full round ball. Nobody talked about that crap. Like it was just a nozzle. You open it up, water comes out.
Right. I worked for two fire departments before I realized that 1.75 inch wasn't 1.75 inch, and I couldn't even tell you the manufacturer of hose that the other two fire departments ran. I mean, like when I was first starting in the fire service, those conversations weren't being had, and nobody cared.
Yeah,
If there was hose on the rig, that's what mattered. And this was 1.75 inch, this was 2.5. That was the end of the conversation. Come to find out, the department that I worked for first full time, they were using 3 inch as their attack line. It wasn't even 2.5.
yeah,
It was straight 3 inch, you know. And I didn't bat an eye at it because I didn't know that those were the conversations that I needed to have. You know, that was
sure.
all I knew at that time.
Well, and that's, it's funny that you bring up it's got to fit for your department. So when we bought our last engine, the committee was looking at different hose beds and I was pushing a low hose bed so hard like that. That's the only thing I wanted to have the lowest hose bed in the state of Kansas. And I don't, for anybody that's watching that doesn't know this, Wichita holds that title. Like they have the absolute lowest hose bed ever. And so I asked the Pierce rep, I said, hey, how close can you get us to theirs? And he was like, it might be like an inch or two, higher. And so I kept trying to push it, and I couldn't get any traction with the administration. And what it ended up being was that we had a very aggressive firefighter who was like 5'2". And she's like, every time I get up on the bumper, I can't reach the damn hose. Like I got to climb up the
I feel her
stairs.
pain, man. That's me every day.
Yeah. And so it was so funny because the chief was like, well, yeah, we should get a low hose bed so she can actually pull the hose line without having to get all the way up the steps and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Like this is, and then I thought about it for a second. I was like, well, I mean, we're getting low hose beds, but her and I still joke about that. She's like, yeah, you just keep telling people that it was your idea and I'll keep telling people that I'm the reason why we got it.
Absolutely. I'm okay with
But
that.
yeah,
You
I mean,
still won. At the
oh
end of the day,
yeah,
you still won.
every time I see the back of that truck, I'm like, we won. I mean, it is
Yes.
literally like waist height is where our hose bed is. But yeah, I think that there's a lot more departments that are putting time and effort and thought process into it. Um, as far as the nozzle stuff, and I wanted to ask your opinion on this, there are so many different questions about full round versus half cut. Do you think we're past that? Like, do you think everybody is pretty much going to full rounds, or do you still go out? Because I think it's pretty well known that full round is going to be better.
Right. I mean, I think it's one of those things where it goes back to people not realizing what they actually have on their rig. And so the times that I find like a half cut or something like that, people don't even realize it, And there's been a couple of times, I wouldn't say recently now, but within the last year or so, where I got a picture and they're like, man, why is my stream just crap right now? And come to find out, that was the issue. It was the ball inside of the bale that was the issue. It had nothing to do with the nozzle. It had nothing to do, with the body of it. It was just that it was a half cut ball and it was paired with a smooth bore. And
Yeah.
I think people just have to realize that, it's not difficult to do this. That's what it's intended to do. Is it's intended to make this easier.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're having issues doing this, you're not taking care of your nozzles the way that it should. And that's something that we do on a regular basis. I mean, we do an apparatus day once a week, and I mean, at a minimum, once a month, they're getting pulled off, they're getting washed out inside of there, and we're making sure it does this okay. We don't run a hose bed cover or anything like that. And I mean, we're in Colorado where we have de-icer on the road and all kinds of that. So they get gummed up. Take care of your nozzles. When you notice they're gummed up, take them off, rinse them off. All it takes is a little bit of soap and water and it'll do this, no problem.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So yeah, there's really no reason to get a gimmicky setup with your nozzle body. All that is a restriction in your waterway.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, you brought it up earlier and I wanted to kind of circle back around to it. When you talk about simplistic nozzles, I mean, it is so much easier to clean and make ready, either a fixed gallonage or a smooth bore. And I always laugh because people are like, oh man, what do you do if like this nozzle breaks? And I'm like, well, if it's a one piece nozzle, that thing's out of service, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when we started going to break aparts, which is the other part of the equation, to your point, if you like the 7/8, but you really want to move into a 15/16, you're talking anywhere between $80 and $100 for a new tip. So
Right.
you can buy that 7/8 and run that for a couple of years and get people used to it. And then when you're ready to transition, once you get better hose or whatever, now you're not talking $700 or $800 for a new nozzle. You're talking $80 to $100 per nozzle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a smoothbore tip is dirt cheap. It really is at the end of the day. So, I mean, you can spend $1,200-$1,300 on a fog nozzle, or you can spend $400 on a smoothbore. I mean, it's fiscally responsible
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
run smoothbores, but I recognize that a smoothbore nozzle is not the appropriate nozzle for all fires. There are fires like confined spaces, attic fires, dumpster fires, any type of outside fire. Fog nozzle will run circles around the smoothbore in those settings. So
Sure.
you got to have them on your rig. Don't take them off of your rig. There's a purpose for them. Run them, have them pre-connected even. I'm not saying that. But at the end of the day, yeah, the simplicity wins out like we're talking about. It's cheaper. It's so much easier to use.
Yeah. And I talk about this in one of the classes that we do for driver operator stuff, pump ops, and then I also talk about it in our engine company class. But I always equate it back to law enforcement. And if you look at how law enforcement functions, they have a sidearm on their hip,
Mm-hmm.
and then they have a shotgun or a rifle, a long gun in the car or in the trunk, and then it kind of escalates from there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I couldn't even imagine if you like showed up to something and they pulled their handgun out and then that didn't work. So they went and popped the trunk and there was like 8 more handguns. Like the first
Yeah.
handgun didn't work. So why are you pulling out more handguns? But in the fire service, we're still doing that crap. Like
Yeah.
the first inch and 3/4 didn't work. So let's go pull another inch and 3/4.
Absolutely.
And so I love the fact like the way our rigs are set up is we have a fog nozzle on the front bumper. And then every pre-connect past that is smooth bore. And then coming off the rear, we have a mix between fog and smoothbore of different sizes. And so we have the ability to, like, if I pull up as a company officer and I'm like, damn, that's a lot of fire, we're going straight to, for us, inch and 3/16.
Hmm.
Whereas, like on the career side, and I laughed when you said it earlier, I'm pulling a 3-inch line with the selectable gallonage nozzle up to 250. So I didn't buy it. It's not my deal, but that's what I got to work with. And so
Hmm.
we're going to pull to a 250 gallon a minute fog nozzle, and that's what we're going to have to put it out with.
Right. Right. So yeah, you're dragging a lot of water weight behind you, but at least
Yeah.
you have a big line option. And there are a lot in the American Fire Service who have kind of gone the wrong way with that too, where they're like, the 2 inch is going to solve all of our problems. And so they have like an 1 3/4 line with like 160 set up, and then they'll jump to maybe 200, 210 out of their 2 inch line, and they stop right there.
Yeah.
Um, because it's a more maneuverable line. I mean, we can't not argue that that's the case. It is a maneuverable line. But the fact is, I mean, you can get outgunned pretty quick if you stop at 210 gallons per minute.
Yeah.
So having that big line option is a huge deal. And having a smart big line option is a big deal too, for sure. The department that I worked for first, like we also had a 3 inch line. And I mean, the nozzle on that was, a house in itself that probably was rated to flow to 350 gallons. But oh my gosh,
Yeah.
trying to support that. And again, like I didn't know the questions to ask at the time. And so I just assumed that it took 4 people to flow that line, not realizing
That's what we
that
all grew up thinking, man. Like that was so
exactly.
common.
Exactly. And I talk a lot about the 2.5 now, and I've just kind of fallen into that because I started asking those questions, and I realized that there was a significantly smarter way to do this job than some of my first experiences in fire academies and my first couple of departments, just because I didn't know what I didn't know, and other people didn't know what they didn't know,
Yeah.
and you kind of just look at that sticker that says 350 gallons per minute, and that sounds really good, which it does. But the reality of it is yeah, 4 people might have to hold on to that thing because it's being pumped at 100 psi at the tip, and you're going to have 170 pounds of nozzle reaction to accomplish that, and you're going to destroy your guys for
Absolutely.
very little benefit when you put the two lines side by side, when you've got a line that you can move around, that you can
Mhm.
keep open for a significantly longer period of time, uh, you know, you win when you're doing things smart. That's for sure.
No, absolutely. And and you brought it up when we were off camera before this, but I mean, what hill do you want to die on?
Hmm.
And, I always laugh, like every time I do my rig checks, every time I open up that compartment with the high rise pack, I smile and I kind of chuckle. And then I go around to the back of the rig and there's the 3-inch line and I kind of chuckle. But
Hmm.
it's true. I mean, what we teach as instructors and what we believe in isn't always what we have at work. Like it's not, I'm very blessed in one department because I get kind of what we want.
Hmm.
And then on the other side, it's like I make do with what we have. And
Right.
so it's
Right.
definitely something that not everybody gets to deal with.
So the territory that I'm in now, I would say that 3/4 of the buildings that I respond to on a regular basis are like uh, standpipe equipped buildings that take up significant footprints, and that's a hill I would die on
Yeah.
in that type of territory. But going back to my first department, rural department, we had 15 people total on the department. I'm not going to die on that hill,
Right.
because I'm going to run that call once in my career.
Yeah.
But in the setting that I'm in now, I mean, that's going to affect my life every single day. So that is a hill that I would die on, and that's where going back to, it has to come down to what your fire department is running on a regular basis. Am I meeting the needs of my response territory? And choose those hills that affect your response territory significantly, for
Yeah.
sure.
And I even know, and for those that are watching this, I know plenty of firefighters that work in different districts within one department where they have different nozzles because of their jurisdiction, because of the demographics and the architecture. You have a high industrial area
Hmm.
with huge buildings. They have higher flow nozzles than the demographic of high-rise apartments. And then it's even different going to, single story, single family neighborhoods. And,
Hmm.
and so, I wish that everything was just 100% uniform, but sometimes it doesn't need to be.
Right. I had this conversation a couple weeks ago with an officer in my own department who's a roving officer, so he doesn't have an assigned place right now. He roves a particular district, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to stay in those, 5 firehouses. He could be staying anywhere in the city, just depending on the needs of that. And he brought up the point. He's like, "Man, I kind of wish that all of our rigs were uniform, because as an officer, if you don't know the firefighters, it's nice to know, at least to have some familiarity with the rig itself."
Sure.
Um, and I told him, I'm like, "Man, I'm not sold on that. I'm really not." Because I worked for a fire department that was running a pretty uniform setup across the board. There were a couple of differences in terms of nozzles, but in terms of hose loads, in terms of lengths, that was pretty set. And so what we then had is we had, downtown companies whose stretches are almost always vertical, running a triple layer, and it was almost comical sometimes seeing these companies trying to take a triple layer up 4 flights of stairs to make a fire attack,
Absolutely.
and that worked phenomenally out in, the surrounding parts of, the city. It was big enough that we had, almost 100 fire stations. So it worked great in many areas, but there were some areas that just did not make sense. And in those situations, uniformity actually killed some of those stretches.
Yeah.
So I'm not sold on it. You got to set up your rigs to match where you're at.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely number one. And it's funny because when we go, and I'm sure you've been in this situation too. In fact, I think we might have actually talked about this. It's so funny to be able to go in and be the person that can say this stuff to a department because we don't work there. Like I can
Right.
walk in and I'm like, hey, you guys brought me here to teach this class, but I'm going to tell you, you're not doing that right. And here's why. And people are like, dude, I can't believe you just said that. I'm like, why? What are they going to fire me? Like, I'll work here. And
You
but
might not
I
get the invite back depending on who you've offended in the process, but hey.
I got to be honest with you, man. Like I've had some really, really good luck. Like I've had some really receptive chiefs or chief officers or decision makers. I mean, it doesn't even have to be chiefs. I've had some really, really good results with that because I don't like shove it in their face, but I'm just like, hey,
Right.
did you guys ever think about this? And you and I know if you teach something within 50 miles of where you work or live, nobody listens to you.
No,
I
of
mean,
course
you're
not.
you're not the guy or the gal. And
Hmm.
so, when you go other places, that's happened to me so many times in my career where we've been preaching something as a frontline or not frontline, back end guys and gals are preaching something. We don't get any traction with it, but then an instructor comes in and says the same exact thing, and the chiefs are like, "Why didn't we think of that? That's amazing."
Hmm.
So,
Again, that's a win. You know, it doesn't have to come from me. If
absolutely.
somebody else can come in, awesome. I'll support that guy all day long if I know that, he's here for the right reasons and he's saying, what needs to be done, So whether my name's on it or not, who cares? That's a win.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate it a lot whenever that happens, but I'm with you on that. And I mean, on my own engine when I was back in Houston, we ran selectable gallonage fog nozzles, 100 psi. All the officers there wanted it set to 200 GPM because in Texas GPM is king.
Yeah.
And it took me 2 years of working with a solid officer, like one of the most respected guys that I have for in the fire service. And you just got to be tactful about it and recognize, that you can chip away at it little bits at a time, and it's not going to happen overnight. So you have to kind of strategically plan out how things are going to go. And really, what solidified it for me is I pulled so many strings to get our engine on duty to a nozzle forward class. We were there as a support rig, because they needed to have an apparatus. But I laid it all out on the line, sent emails, and I made sure that we were the ones that were there. And I put my officer through a day of nozzle forward, and finally, it was somebody else coming from the outside and putting us through drills that were focused on just reps and flowing water and moving and all of those things. And that's finally what won it over,
Yeah.
because these were the things that I had been saying for 2 years, and then finally I got him to a class and then it clicked. And he was like, all right, bro, we're running the 15/16 from now on. And I wouldn't change anything. 2 years of that work. Awesome. We
Yeah.
won. Yeah.
Dude, and it's so funny that you mentioned that, because we had my assistant chief was the one that went through my nozzle forward, or when I went through my first nozzle forward class in Lawrence, Kansas. I drug my assistant chief to it, and it was just like your situation, where we walked out of there with this like, oh my God, what have we been doing for the last 15 years? Like, how do
Right.
we not know some of this stuff?
Right.
And I love what Aaron says, it's a tool for the toolbox. If you don't like everything, don't use it. And there's stuff that we didn't use, but it made it so much easier for decision makers to be able to go back and say, okay, this is what we did. Oh, and by the way, the assistant chief went through the class and he's in the corner going, yeah, let's do what he's saying. And it's like,
Right.
okay.
Right.
So,
Well, and that's the beauty of it, is you can pick and choose what you need and what is going to be beneficial. That class was career changing for me. I've been like no less than like, I don't know. It's been 5 times, but not 5 times in whole. I don't clamp slide on my day
right.
job, but that's okay. The rest of that class was career changing for me, and I'll toot their horn all day long. That was phenomenal. Every
Absolutely.
firefighter should take that class. But yeah, it's not necessarily take everything and reject everything else. It's, how can we use this to benefit our fire department?
Absolutely. So
And
not change,
that's how you have to approach it as an instructor too. Anytime
sure.
you go out to any of these, places, there's no reason to be offended. There's no reason to tell them that everything they're doing is absolutely wrong. You have to do it my way. No, that's not how you approach it at all.
Yeah.
It's, hey, these are the tools that have worked for me. I feel like they could work for you. Let's practice them a little bit. And then it's up to you to decide if you want to adopt it.
And I'm glad that you brought that up. So we had gone and taught a class. I think people watching have probably heard this story before, but we went and taught down in a city called Bront, Texas, which is in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it is out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. And when I was talking to their chief, they were completely unaware of their nozzle flows. They had no idea what they had on the rig. I mean, it was just a nozzle. You open it up, water comes out, that's it.
Right.
And so when we went and looked at them, they were all Elkharts, and they were all stamped with 60 or 65 or 75. And one of the guys that was with me, he goes, so is that the pressure? I'm like, no, that's the GPM. Like, these are old ass nozzles. Like, that's what the flow was back then. And so as we started explaining to this chief, like, hey chief, have you noticed that your fires aren't going out like ever? And he's like, well, yeah. He's like, we got to put like 4 or 5 lines through the window to be able to get enough cooled down so that we can actually go in. And so after we started explaining to him, like, BTUs and GPMs, he got so pissed off, and he was like yelling at me. And I'm like, okay, are we going to get kicked out? Like, are we getting kicked out of this city? And I was like, chief, I'm sorry if I offended you. And he goes, no, 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 no. He goes, I'm not mad at you. I'm mad that I didn't know this, and again, it's one of those things where, like, it's the best of what they had. We're talking a department that has 4 air packs. They're all different brands, and they don't have any spare bottles. There's departments like that all over this country.
Right. It's whatever $1,000 they had left over at the end of the budget. I had to get an SCBA. This was it.
Yep, exactly. And so, but yeah, it was very, he was so incredibly blown away. And I thankfully we still communicate, to this day, but I was so glad. I'm like, okay, he's not going to chase me out of town. But he was very frustrated because he never knew all these little intricacies about flows and BTUs and actually putting the fire out. And he had never connected the dots.
I'm blessed. I work for a career fire department. I'm a nerd. And so I look into this stuff on the side, and there is still, every day it blows my mind what I don't know. I watched a webcast with Nick Martin a few days ago where they were talking about cutting flat roofs, and they were getting into the intricacies of the different, saw blades and stuff like that. when you're in the volunteer setting or even the part-time setting, like you have other priorities,
Yeah.
day to day. Like to keep up with all this stuff is ridiculous. And that's where it takes motivated guys across the board. Like one guy can't handle all this stuff. One guy can't be the rope expert. He can't be the hazmat expert. He can't be the saw and the nozzle guy. Like it takes an entire fire department of motivated guys making sure that you're dialed across the board,
Absolutely.
because you're going to get so far behind if you don't take your opportunities where they are to learn and further your knowledge base. The fire departments and the job knowledge that we have changes so rapidly, and the technology it changes so rapidly that you get behind so fast if you're not keeping up with it.
Absolutely. So not to change gears, but I want to ask you this. Color coded nozzles and hoses. So this comes up a lot, and I've actually been asked this multiple times, and I get a different answer depending on the geography of who I'm asking. Right?
Yeah.
What do you guys do out there? What has been your experience? Do you like it? Do you not like it?
I've never worked for a fire department that's done it. The last fire department that I worked for, it was in their hose specs specifically that they wanted orange hose, because there was some old tale that in a near miss, a guy was looking down, he missed the hose line that was white and saw the hose line that was orange, and he got out. So that's all they cared about, was that all the rest of their hose purchases were orange. And so like I can't speak to a fire department that says, you know what, the red pre-connect runs 160 at 50 GP, it's 200 feet long, and the green pre-connect runs 7/8. Yeah, I really can't speak to that. I see the logic in it. I think where that becomes pretty difficult is that adds not only to the hose that you have to have on your engine, but it has to add to the hose that you have in reserve on your rack, making sure that that's pressure tested, that it's in sufficient quantities at each of the apparatus. Like logistically, that is tough.
Yeah.
And especially for fire departments that don't have the budget to keep up with that, that's a rabbit hole that you're going to get down that you're going to regret pretty quickly. And so you're rapidly going to have, green hose on the end of red hose, and everybody's going to be confused because it's all supposed to be green. So I think that it's a decent idea for those departments who just have these astronomical budgets.
Yeah.
I mean, there are departments out there who at the end of the year, they're like, what should we spend our money on? And that's awesome. I haven't worked for them. And I don't think that there are too many who are that way. So I think it's something that's admirable, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessary.
Yeah. Well, and so we're not this way anymore, which thank goodness we're not. But when I first started on the volunteer department that I'm on now, it was, yellow pre-connect, yellow handle, yellow pistol grip, yellow bail, yellow hose. And it was like, okay, so wait a minute. So if I want to fire, I need to tell them up on yellow. And that was fine until like I had a driver operator who was colorblind. And so you would tell him up on yellow, and this dude legit would stand there and stare at the hose. And I'm like, hey man, what are you doing? He's like, which one's yellow? I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, dude, I'm colorblind. I can't see the colors. I'm like, holy shit. So it's just, I feel like we have gotten away from that in a good way. What we ended up doing is an 1.75" attack lines are yellow, 2.5 attack lines are orange, and they're very distinct, yellow and orange. It's not like they're close. We do have some 3-inch floating around for our tenders to be able to fill, and so those are blue, and then obviously our LDH is yellow.
Right.
And so I feel like having the standardized hose size colors is a good compromise.
Right. And I mean, I guess that I could say I've seen that significantly more often than I've seen, trying to get into a situation like with extrication tools where you can say up on red, up on blue, something like that, which is very handy in that situation. And usually, I mean, you're only 100 feet from your operator, you're not in the same type of IDLH that you are with a hose line. So the communication's a little bit easier there. But yeah, I see that a lot more often between hose sizes. Um, for me, where it really matters on the hose line is I want to know what nozzle section I have, because we have good sections and we have bad sections. So
Yeah.
we pay attention to that a lot. So significantly more important to me than color is what section do I have at the tip, making sure that that's working the best for me. Um, and I mean, on my engine right now, we have, I think we figured it out the other day, we have 4 different manufacturers or different generations of the same manufacturer. So yeah, we play with that significantly because that's going to affect our pump discharge pressure. It's going to affect our nozzle whip. It's going to affect a lot of things. So we pay attention to that, but um, I'm not as worried about what color those lines are. At the end of the day, I just want water to come out of it in
Yeah.
a way that's beneficial to me so I can fight fire, you know? With that being said, one thing that we do as a fire department is each apparatus is color coded, and we put basically electrical tape with
Hmm.
our apparatus's colors on it. So every piece of equipment that comes off of our rig is color coded, but that's so that we can find it at the end of a second alarm fire. When I left my axe by the front door, I know that that's engine three's axe instead of,
Right.
truck eight's axe. So I think that's awesome. But as far as having to have a particular line inside, nah.
Dude, I'm telling you, man, like we legit had fires where it looked like Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Like it was insane. Like you're walking around the fire scene and there's like 8 different colors. There's purple, white, blue, green, orange, tan. And I'm like, what? So who's on the red line? And they're like, that's engine 16. I'm like, okay, cool. Who's on the blue line? And they're like, I don't really know. I'm like, and then I get on the radio. I'm like, hey, like this is when I'm command. I get on the radio. I'm like, hey, who's on pre-connect 2? And the guys are like, I don't know. I'm on the blue line. I'm like, oh my God. So when we got away from that, it was one of the easiest transitions because we just started teaching people when you pull that pre-connect or when you hook up to a discharge, it's right there. Just read what number it is.
Mhm.
And that's what we use as our vernacular.
I mean, I could see that being one more layer that could complicate things for IC. If IC is wondering who's on the blue line, rather than using the verbiage of, okay, who's my primary attack line versus who's my backup line,
Right.
who cares what color it is? I
Right.
know that, engine 8 is on the primary attack line and engine 3 is on backup. So I'm expecting them to be protecting, the upstairs exposures. That's one less thing to worry about as far
Yeah.
as, engine 3 has, blue lines, engine 8 has red lines, engine, 9 has tan,
Yeah.
that we don't need our IC or our officers wondering, who's who. Just
Well, and
where
don't
are
even
they
get
at? How do I help them out if they need help?
right. Well, and don't even get me started on like the people and they didn't do it maliciously. It wasn't like they were trying to do it. And I'm sure that for the people in the departments that are doing this, you're going to know what I'm going to say here in about 30 seconds. You got, your pre-connect 1 is a yellow line and your pre-connect 2 is a orange line or a blue line or a red line or whatever it is. But then you got that one bad section at the end. So they go ahead and swap it out with a different color.
Absolutely.
And so, now they're up on the second floor and they're like, up on green. And then they're like, we don't even have a green line off the rig. What the hell are you talking about? So
Mhm.
the color coding thing, I understand the thought behind it, but I agree with you. It's not for us. I mean, we completely moved away from it. I'd love to hear what other people are doing, what they think.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't not work for that fire department. I think it's, something that, could be beneficial in that situation where, I'm stuck, find the blue line. The blue line heads out,
Right.
okay, I'll find the blue line then, but it hasn't been necessary thus far in my career.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. So, how can people get a hold of you? I mean, I know you're with Fire by Trade, but I know you do a lot
Mhm.
of instructing outside of that as well. So, how can people hit you up?
Probably the easiest is Facebook. I mean, that hits the phone right away. I have notifications and stuff like that. So Messenger, shoot me up on Messenger, just Jonathan Brumley. You can always give me a phone call, send me a text. I don't necessarily always answer out of state phone phone numbers the first time. So if you call me, leave a message and I'll be sure to get back to you. 970-405-8963. And then my email is j.brumley33@yahoo.com. That's probably the easiest way is either Facebook or a text message, and I'll get back to you with
That's
whatever
awesome.
you need.
And I will vouch for Jonathan. The first time I called him, he did not hit the FU button. And like 5 seconds after I hung up from my voicemail, he called me right back. He was like, "Sorry, man, I didn't know who this was. Like, I saw that phone number. I was like, what the hell's
Oh man,
913?"
robocallers have killed it for us, man. Like
Dude,
zero trust anymore in an out-of-state phone number.
every other, even local numbers, man. Like I get phone calls from local numbers, and I'm like, I only know one person in that town, and I answer it. I'm like, "Hey, what's up? You've won a trip to Hawaii." I'm like, "Ugh."
Got me again, man. Got me again.
Oh yeah. So, but no,
Um,
man, I appreciate you being on. It's always fun talking to you.
yeah,
I know these times are rough. It's looking like it's going to get a little worse before it gets a lot better, hopefully.
yeah.
So,
Hoping those vaccines come quickly.
yeah, no
Not because I
joke.
want one, but because I want everybody else to get one so that I can fly again.
We were just talking about that at work the other day. Somebody was like, "Hey, Melon, you going to take the vaccine?" I'm like, "No, but I want everybody else to."
Yeah, I know. Let all the zombies come out before I'd have to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, man. Well, thanks for being with us, and for everybody that sends in the questions, we appreciate it. Thanks, Blake, for sending in yours. Can't make this stuff up, so I appreciate you guys giving us ideas. You can always hit us up on Facebook, Valor Fire Training, or shoot me a message, David@valorfiretraining.com. Until the next time we see each other, take care, be safe. We'll talk to you soon.